You're watching the Creator Channel. Please like the video and subscribe.
When King Montrys Darklin of Crown Hill died, the Crown lands did not settle. It lurched. The Lords wanted an older hand. The Senate of Crown Hill wanted quiet. The City Watch wanted its arrears, and the barracks wanted gifts that no sober treasury could pay. Into that weariness came King Olivar Hightower of Oldtown, stern, late in life, respected on paper, and already carrying the look of a man asked to mend a roof during a storm instead of under clear sky. He entered Crown Hill under dark banners, not bright ones, and the city understood at once that feasts were over, indulgence was over, and a harder age had begun. Olivar's first mistake was thinking respect and obedience were the same thing. He paid ledgers before he paid feelings, counted granaries before he counted friendships, and refused to hand out the donatives that too many men in the City Watch had already decided were theirs. He dismissed officers tied to the last reign, refused to honor every whispered promise made in Montrys' last chaos, and turned his anger on sailors and marines, who demanded that their sudden wartime promotions be made permanent. At the Blackwater crossing outside the city, the confrontation turned ugly, then bloody, and Olivar Hightower ordered a massacre that Crown Hill never forgave. When the survivors were dragged away and punished again by lot, the old king proved he understood discipline, but not timing. In a capital still bruised from fire, purges, confiscations, and royal madness, he chose terror where he needed balance. He made it worse in the court. Olivar seized property from families tied to the old revels, clawed money back through hard-handed treasurymen, and let his closest advisers grow rich while speaking the language of virtue. The poor heard there would be no easy grain. The middle ranks saw auctions that favored insiders. The great houses watched an old king tell himself he was cleansing the realm while his own circle fattened under the work. Even the Senate of Crown Hill, which had wanted a corrective after Montrys Darklin, began to mutter that the correction had arrived in the wrong body. He looked like order. He felt like a funeral with tax collectors at the door. Then came the succession question, and that finished him. Every ambitious lord in Crown Hill assumed the old man would need a younger, brighter heir to carry the dynasty forward, and among them none moved with more confidence than King Orys Redwyn of the Arbor, who at that point was still only Lord Orys, a polished court player with beauty, ease, debts, charm, and the dangerous ability to make armed men feel seen. Olivar let the city assume Orys would be chosen, then humiliated him in public by adopting Lord Lucerys Velaryon of Driftmark instead, a colder figure who looked safer to old eyes. The choice stunned the capital. In one stroke, Olivar Hightower angered the City Watch factions Orys had been grooming for months, and taught every hungry man near the throne that the king could still ruin a future with a sentence. 5 days later, Crown Hill changed masters. Orys slipped out of ceremony, crossed into the camp, and spoke exactly the language Olivar refused to speak: coin, gratitude, grievance, and promise. The City Watch had been made to feel cheap under Olivar. Orys made them feel necessary. That was enough the king was cut down in the confusion. Lord Lucerys Velaryon of Driftmark fell soon after, and by nightfall their heads were on display, while Orys was being saluted as king by the same city that had pretended a week earlier to value law above all things. There was even a quick, live-feeling moment that later singers loved to repeat, Orys being lifted by shouting gold cloaks at the camp gate, cloak torn, hair loose, blood on one cheek not his own, smiling like a man who had just outrun a prophecy and landed in it at the same time. King Orys Redwyn of the Arbor ruled only a blink, though it was a crowded blink. He was generous where Olivar had been mean, open where Olivar Hightower had been distant, and eager to charm the city back into believing it had chosen wisely. He courted the Senate, restored entertainments, and tried to make the palace feel light again, yet his reign was never truly about ruling. It was about racing the Western armies already marching toward him. On the far marches and the river roads, the men who had first lifted King Harris Hoare of Pike did not care that Crown Hill had exchanged one ruler for another. They had risen against weakness, then against insult, and now against the sight of a capital once more deciding the empire through corridor murder instead of hard campaigning. Harris came out of the Western world with the rough strength Orys lacked. He had the Iron Islands name, the hard camp following, the appetite of a field ruler, and the kind of army that feels more dangerous after weeks of bad weather than after a parade. He also had captains who had no intention of letting the city steal this crown from them in silk gloves. Orys tried letters first, then negotiation, then hurried military gathering, and none of it held long enough. The decisive clash came on the western approach east of Bitterbridge, where Orys's men arrived tired, strung out, and too hopeful that one last bargain might still spare them the full weight of the collision. Harris struck them before that hope could die naturally. The front broke, the retreat curled inward, and by dusk Orys knew the city could be dragged through another month of killing if he chose to keep breathing. He did not. He took his own life in camp and left the field to Harris, which won him more respect in death than he had ever possessed in power. King Harris Hoare of Pike entered Crown Hill like a conqueror who had mistaken possession for mastery. He rewarded his western fighters, feasted too publicly, laughed too loudly, and let the city know that the men who had taken it would enjoy taking it. To win the lower quarters he played at remembering Monterey's, kept games alive, encouraged racing, and let the mob think that an island king could still love noise and spectacle. To frighten the great houses, he packed the guard lanes with his own men and made promotion smell of salt and campfire instead of parchment. One short scene from the early Hoare months of rule tells the whole mood. At Harrenhal, beneath torch smoke and hanging banners, a mailed favourite of Harris Hoare split a noble challenger across the brow in a one-on-one bout, and the king threw his head back laughing, while half the gallery cheered, and the other half quietly understood what kind of reign this would be. He also governed badly enough to breed his own destroyer. Harris Hoare trusted appetite over balance. He insulted old houses, overfavoured his captains, treated the capital like plunder with walls, and allowed private revenge to creep into royal ritual. In the Kingswood, a hunting death took one of the lords who had hesitated before bending the knee, and though the court called it a boar strike, no one truly believed the tusks had chosen their own angle. The Senate bent in public and recoiled in private. The City Watch began discovering that serving a hard camp king was not the same as serving the city. That opened the road for the fourth and final claimant of the year, a man who had spent the whole chaos far from Crown Hill, doing the one thing none of the other three had managed for long, holding a real command together. That man was King Lionel Baratheon of Storm's End. Long before the crown started changing hands by the season, Lionel had built a career the old way, command by command, front by front. He had fought on the Western Islands, held Storm Coast fleets together, served in the Stepstones lanes, and later won a stronger reputation in the East where trade, faith and rebellion knotted together around ancient caravan roads. By the time Oliver Hightower died, and Orys Redwyne took his short turn, and Harris Hoare crashed into Crown Hill, Lionel Baratheon was already in Essos with a seasoned host, suppressing the Great Covenant, rising in the sacred hill country of Hasdan, a dry-walled holy city whose temple law, ancestral rites, and feast calendar had bound its people together for generations. The trouble there had started the imperial way, with insult, silver, and overreach. A royal seizure of temple wealth, riots between locals and merchant blocks, and clumsy killings by crown officers had turned grievance into revolt. Lord General Lionel Baratheon was sent east to close it. Instead, he found a full religious war waiting for him. Hasdan was no ordinary rebellious town. It sat on hard ground above its wells, held by layered walls, old towers, steep approaches, and the great sanctuary called the House of the Covenant, where no image of any ruler was meant to stand. Pilgrims came there from the inland roads and the southern coasts. Merchant traffic crossed under its shadow. Volantine interests watched it. Braavosi counting men watched it. Dorne watched it. Inside the city, rival leaders shredded any chance of an early settlement. Lord Jonas of Gaz, Lord Simon Cotter, and Keeper Eleazar of the Inner Court, each claiming to defend the faith while cutting into the same food stock and the same frightened population. Lionel did not storm the city at once. He cleared the outer district, took the lesser towns, closed the sea road, and then handed the tightening noose to his elder son, Prince Steffon Baratheon of Storm's End, who was young enough to gain a legend from the work and old enough to deserve one. This is where the real shape of the next dynasty first appeared. While Harris stuffed Crown Hill with saltmen and feast talk, Lionel and Steffon Baratheon were building something harder in the east. They had 4 disciplined field hosts between them: engineers, siegecraft, fleet cover, and allies who mattered beyond the old Senate lanes. Prince Corin Martell of Sunspear became one of the key eastern partners, not a subordinate, not a flatterer, but a necessary desert sea statesman who understood convoy war, dry country movement, and what it meant to reduce a holy city without turning the whole coast against you in 1 month. Around Lionel there also formed what later records first call the King's Council, an inner ring of generals, sea lords, quartermasters, and trusted nobles whose business lay beyond the reach of the full Senate of Crown Hill. This did not replace the Senate. It sidestepped it, and from that moment on, the Empire had 2 centers of statecraft: the old robe room on the hill and the war table around the king. The Senate of Crown Hill also began changing in the same season, though not yet to the size it would later reach. Under the pressure of Eastern war, convoy finance, and Volantine trade knots, more men from the sea lanes began finding places near power: Braavosi lenders, Eastern grain brokers, old harbor families, Roynish counting houses tied to Old Town and the Blackwater. They were not yet the swollen Eastern bloc of later generations, but this was the beginning of it, the moment Western rule first had to admit that Eastern money and Eastern logistics could no longer be treated as distant tools. Harris Hoare still sat the throne in Crown Hill, but Lionel Baratheon held the grain road, the Eastern Fleet Line, the better commanders, and the stronger future. Men watching carefully began to understand which crown might last longer than a season. By the close of that year, the empire was split between the king who had seized the capital and the king who had not yet taken it but already looked larger than it. Harris Hoare had Crown Hill, feasts, noise, and the last flare of violent momentum. Lionel had the east, the field, the fleet lanes, the beginnings of a new governing circle, and a son before the walls of Hasdan learning how to turn a siege into inheritance. In the holy city itself, the worst signs were already there. Pilgrims trapped inside during the Feast of Remembrance, rival factions burning stores that should have fed children, desperate sermons from the inner courts, and scouts reporting that Prince Steffon Baratheon's ring was closing tighter every week. The year of 4 lords was not ending in peace. It was narrowing toward one last western reckoning and one great eastern destruction. By the time King Lionel Baratheon of Storm's End turned west toward Crown Hill, the Empire had already begun deciding in its bones which claimant belonged to the future and which belonged to the noise of a bad year. King Harris Hoare still held the capital, still had the throne room, the city gates, the feasting halls, and enough armed men to frighten a lesser challenger into delay. But the deeper instruments of rule were sliding away from him one by one. Grain moved under Lionel's seal more reliably than under Harris's. The Eastern Fleet captains answered storm banners sooner than island colors. Men who had once thought Harris looked like strength began noticing that he drank too long, punished too personally, and confused possession with command. Lionel did not rush the matter. That was the first sign he was different from the others. King Olivar Hightower of Old Town had tried to correct the realm with age and principle. King Orys Redwyn of the Arbor had tried to charm it faster than events could overtake him. King Harris Hoare had tried to batter it into obedience with camp force and appetite. Lionel worked more slowly than all of them. He secured the storm coast. He brought the Blackwater approaches under tighter patrol. He made sure the road from the Reach into the capital would feed his men instead of starve them. He tightened his circle around generals and lords he trusted, and it was in these months that the king's council became more than a wartime habit. At Lionel's side stood Prince Steffon Baratheon, Prince Corin Martell of Sunspear, Lord Tytos Lannister of Casterly Rock, Lord Denise Valerian of Driftmark, and Lord Gawain Morrigan of Crow's Nest, men who did not need the full Senate of Crown Hill to tell them what a collapsing empire required. They were not robes in a chamber. They were the hard table around the king. Crown Hill felt the pressure before the army arrived. The city markets became tense, then cautious, then openly divided. One fishmonger cursed Harris in the morning and toasted him by dusk. A ship captain who had praised the Iron Islands king at supper was discovered before dawn arranging terms with Valerion men for safe harbor when the storm fleet came up the bay. The Senate of Crown Hill, always braver in groups than alone, began speaking of constitutional balance again now that another stronger man was approaching to make the speeches safe. Harris Hoare answered all this the only way he knew how, with display, threat, and the sort of hard justice that satisfies followers for a day and frightens neutrals for a season. Another lord died in the Kingswood on a hunt, arranged too carefully to be innocent. A pair of senators were dragged to questioning and came back older in the face, if not in the year. Even some of his own officers started keeping their cloaks on indoors, which is never a good sign in a capital. The first collision came not before Crown Hill itself, but west of the city where the roads narrow and a commander can still shape a battle before stone walls and alley rumor start interfering. Harris pushed out to meet Lionel before the Storm King could close fully around the capital, and for a moment that decision looked wise. He still had speed, still had men who loved a direct fight, and still hoped that one bruising victory would make half the uncertain realm bow by habit. Instead, he found the one opponent that year who understood how to let an enemy spend his force before the true breaking point arrived. Lionel fixed the center, bent the left, rather than let it shatter, and let Harris commit farther than he should have. Then Lord Tytos Lannister of Casterly Rock struck the exposed line with Western heavy horse, while Lord Gawain Morrigan of Crow's Nest pushed the storm infantry uphill through shield crush and broken spearwood. Harris fought hard enough that later camp songs among the islands remembered that day with pride, but by sunset the field belonged to Lionel, and the road to Crown Hill had stopped being a road of rescue. It had become a road of return and reckoning. Harris retreated into the capital and discovered too late that cities do not love being used as second shields. The harbor held for him only in part. The lower markets grew sullen. The city watch obeyed but did not lean. When he tried to rouse the crowd with games and distributions, the effect was thin and embarrassed, like a feast set out in a sick room. One remembered scene from those days captures the whole decline. Harris stood in a gallery above a practice yard, watching his favorite captain cut down 3 challenges in succession, and for a heartbeat the old roar rose again. Then the cheering broke in the middle and dissolved, as if the crowd had suddenly remembered who was outside the walls and who had been dying in the fields to keep this king laughing. That is when even his household began sending feelers outward. The fall of King Harris Hoare was ugly and fast. Lionel did not need a grand assault once the city had gone hollow around its ruler. He tightened the cordon, worked through the gates, took one tower, then another, and let fear do the rest. Some island captains tried to cut their way toward the harbor and died among overturned wagons and burning timbers. Others made private bargains and vanished into the confusion. Harris himself fought in the last contraction of the struggle and nearly reached the river stairs before the crush closed around him. Accounts differ on whether he died by his own hand, by a loyal retainer who spared him capture, or under the blades of storm men in a final stand. What never differed was the shape of the result. By the time dawn reached the upper city, Harris was dead, the island claim had failed, and King Lionel Baratheon stood as the only man in the Empire who looked equal to the weight of the thing. His entrance into Crown Hill carried a different air from any of the rulers before him. Lionel did not come in like a buyer, a revenger, or a rebel king. He came in like a commander arriving at the headquarters he had earned. The Crown Guard was reorganized around him. The City Watch was not trusted blindly, but neither was it humiliated for sport. The Senate of Crown Hill was made to kneel to a settled fact rather than invited to pretend it had shaped one. This was also the point where the Senate itself began changing in a more visible way. The old 20 and 30 seats no longer seemed enough for a state stretched across western waters, storm coasts, eastern contracts, and a soci supply lane. More eastern-linked men entered the political rooms now. Braavosi lenders, harbour notables with Volantis ties, old merchant families from Blackwater Bay, men whose grandfathers might once have been treated as useful outsiders and who were now too embedded in the Empire's arteries to ignore. The old Senate still sat, but it no longer reflected the whole machine beneath it. Even with the crown secured, Lionel did not linger in luxury. That was the second great difference in him. He had not won the Empire merely to sit above it. The true labour of his early reign still lay in Essos, where Prince Stefan Baratheon was tightening the noose around Hasdan, and where what had begun as a provincial revolt had turned into the defining siege of the age. Lionel crossed east after settling the city enough to leave it breathing, taking with him part of the King's Council and enough authority to make clear that the Eastern War was no side expedition. It was the proving ground of the new dynasty. Hasdan had only grown worse while crowns rose and fell in the west. The city's outer districts were already scarred by fire, famine, and rival faction fighting. The holy enclosure at its center, the House of the Covenant, had become both refuge and prison. Pilgrims trapped inside during the Feast of Remembrance now ate through stores meant for months. Priests condemned one another in open courtyards. Merchant families bought guards with silver one day and denounced them as traitors the next. The city leaders had ceased to govern and started to devour each other. Lord Jonos of Gaz held the upper market quarter with his men and claimed only he could save the people. Lord Simon Kadar had the inner towers and blamed every defeat on compromise. Keeper Eleazar of the inner court demanded purity even as children starved in streets beneath his sermons. Once a city reaches that point, walls stop protecting it. They only preserve the fever inside longer. Prince Stefan understood that before he was old enough for some lords to accept how well he understood it. He did not throw his men against the walls out of youth or pride. He tightened, measured, waited, and built. Siege lines deepened. Towers rose. Ramps crawled forward. Great engines were dragged into position and shielded with wet hides against fire. The harbor side was watched by Velaryon ships. The inland roads were cut by Martell riders and storm outriders who knew how to kill couriers without letting the city know how complete its isolation had become. There is a clear camp scene remembered from those weeks. Prince Stefan, mud on his boots, cloak thrown over one shoulder, standing with Prince Corin Martell of Sunspear over a wax board lit by 3 oil lamps, while engineers argued over angle, stone weight, and how close they could get the next ram before dawn. The prince listened more than he spoke, then gave his order in one sentence, and went back out into the dark to inspect the ditches himself. Inside Hasdan, the collapse turned inward. Men who should have been defending the walls were dragged instead into street fights over grain, doctrine, and faction vengeance. Households were searched by their own neighbors. Noble women traded jewels for sacks of meal that turned out to be sand at the bottom. Children disappeared in crowd crushes near cistern lines. In the alleys and shrine courts, masked killers began appearing often enough that no one could say whether they were faction enforcers, temple loyalists, mercenary hands, or simply what all dying cities produce in the end, men who realize panic is a trade. At night, fires rose in one quarter or another, some from siege stones, some from defenders burning their own rivals out, and each blaze told the camp outside that the city was helping the siege more than it knew. The first breach did not end the matter. It widened it. A section of outer wall was broken after days of pounding, and storm men surged in only to find the district beyond already half ruined and barricaded by the defenders themselves. Fighting went house to house, stair to stair, court to court. The imperial standards reached one market square, and had to fall back before dusk because there were too many dead bodies underfoot to maneuver cleanly and too many rooftops, still full of stones, darts, and lamp oil. Prince Stefan learned from that failure rather than glorifying it. He withdrew, widened the pressure, and began taking the city in layers instead of lunges. By the time King Lionel Baratheon reached the eastern camp, his son had already shown the one quality that makes dynasties last, not courage alone, but the refusal to mistake courage for method. Lionel's arrival changed the atmosphere without changing the plan. The king did not seize the siege away from Stefan. He enlarged it. He made the father and the son visible together before the walls, old warhorse and rising prince, and everyone in the camp understood the message. The crown was not merely winning a city. It was presenting succession through conquest. The king's council now met under heavier guard and fuller tents. Braavosi money men came into camp more openly. Volantine agents watched from a distance and measured how strong this new regime might become if Hasgarn fell cleanly. The Senate's growth in Crown Hill had begun through necessity. Here, in Essos, the larger truth beneath it showed itself. Westeros could no longer pretend its empire was purely Western while Eastern roads, Eastern faiths, Eastern ports, and Eastern coin were shaping the fate of kings. So this is where the second phase now stands. Lionel Baratheon has taken Crown Hill and founded the new order in fact. Prince Stefan Baratheon has turned Hasdan from a rebellion into a proving ground. The city is starving, divided, holy, and doomed, though it does not yet know which of its inner quarrels will open the final gate. The Senate of Crown Hill is growing. The King's Council is now a permanent thing. Eastern influence is no longer distant, and the new dynasty is about to take its legend not from a coronation, but from fire, breach, and sacred ruin in the east. King Lionel Baratheon chose the stronger challenge. He left the city's inner terror to its own starving factions, and let the greater danger gather on the plain, where the banners of Sana began appearing in waves beyond the eastern road. Hasdan had begged for relief, and relief was coming at last, not as a few hidden killers in side streets, but as a real field host, horse lords, caravan spears, temple levies, and hired blades marching under long streamers that could be seen from the siege ramps at dawn. The camp understood what that meant at once. If the Sonori host broke the ring, Hasdan would breathe again. The holy city would become a fortress for years instead of months, and the new Baratheon order would learn that taking Crown Hill was easier than keeping an empire stretched across the narrow sea. Lionel did not panic. He called his council, looked at the wax board in silence, and began shifting the war from a siege with an army attached to an army with a siege attached. Hasdan itself looked uglier and prouder with each passing day. The outer wall was cracked in places, the lower quarters blackened, and the lanes nearest the breach already half rubble, yet the high sanctuary still rose over everything, white gold in the hot light, ringed by terraces, stair courts, and the old enclosed precinct of the House of the Covenant. Inside those walls the faithful still argued, still prayed, still starved, and still killed one another in the name of preserving what the siege had already doomed. Watchers on the ramps reported 3 banners fighting for authority within the city: the hard men of Lord Jonos of Gaz, the Tower faction of Lord Simon Kadar, and the priestly zeal of Keeper Eleazar of the Inner Court. None of them could govern the city any longer. All of them could still ruin an assault at the right moment. That was why the relief host mattered so much. It gave the dying city one last chance to turn its faith into survival. The Sonori army made a better challenge than a pack of alley killers ever could. It came up in layered columns, light horse first, then armored riders with long lances, then foot companies guarding supply wagons and shrine carts, and behind them came the slower weight, reserve cavalry, and hired companies from the inland roads who had no love for Hasdan, but did love eastern silver. Their commander was King Marcos of Sarna, an old grassland warlord who had learned to fight near cities without letting cities tame him. He did not rush at the siege lines on the first day. He rode the ridges, looked over the camps, measured the ditchwork, tested the Martell scouts, and waited for the holy city to answer his appearance with fire and bells. When the bells came at last from the sanctuary terraces, and a dozen signal flames rose inside Hasdan, the camp of King Lionel Baratheon understood that the city and the field had finally become one battle. This was the moment when the father stepped back, and the son was shown. Word had come from the west that Crown Hill still needed a king's hand on the Senate, the fleet books, and the shaky loyalties of men who had bowed to Baratheon rule quickly and might unbow just as quickly if left too long without the ruler himself before them. Lionel could not stay forever in the east, but he would not leave quietly, and he would not leave the command looking divided. On the morning before he rode back toward the narrow sea, he stood in full black warplate beneath the king's pavilion, while the host gathered by cohorts, standards, and lordly banners. He unclasped the bronze stag circlet from his own helm, the battle crown he had worn since the western victory over King Harris Hoare, and set it with his own hands over the dark helm of Prince Steffon Baratheon. The king kept the imperial crown for Crown Hill. The prince took the war crown of the Eastern campaign. Every man present understood what he was seeing. Steffon wore the change well. The prince had begun the siege in practical steel, mud on the greaves, plain cloak, plain commands, a commander too busy to dress for memory. After his father's departure, he came out in darker armor, ridged black plate with storm gold edging, a stag worked across the chest, and the bronze war circlet low over the brow. Men later said it was not the armor alone they remembered, but the way he looked through it, steady-eyed, not grand in the soft court sense, not smiling, not posturing, just fixed on the field in front of him as if the whole burden had finally arrived and found the right shoulders. At his side stood Prince Coran Martell of Sunspear, red gold in lighter scale, and Lord Tytos Lannister, heavier in gilded western plate, each man different in style and temper, all three bound to the same line of work. When the prince mounted and turned his horse toward the eastern ridge, the host shouted for him as the king's son first, and the king's equal in war second. The relief battle opened in dust and distance. King Marcos of Sarner sent his light horse ahead in a broad crescent screen, loosing into the outer pickets, trying to draw Steffon into a loose chase that would crack the siege line open from its own impatience. Steffon refused it. He anchored his center with storm spears and crownland infantry behind ditchwork already dug for the siege, placed Prince Coran Martell of Sunspear and the Dornish on the open flank where speed would matter, and kept Lord Tytos Lannister and the Western Reserve back far enough that the Sarnori horse had to guess whether the gold cloaks on the ridge were the true hammer or only bait. Then the push began in earnest. Sarnori lancers came on hard from the left. Temple infantry from Hasdon sallied through a broken outer gate to strike the ditch line at the same time, and for one long hour it looked as though the whole eastern host might be crushed between the wall and the plain. Men drowned, Sarnori lances, came on hard from the left. Temple infantry from Hasdon sallied through a broken outer gate to strike the ditch line at the same time, and for one long hour it looked as though the whole eastern host might be crushed between the wall and the plain. The trench where they stood. Spears splintered. Horses rolled screaming into sharpened stakes. The prince held the center with his own household around him and did not move until the field itself told him where the day would open. It opened on the Dornish flank. Prince Coran Martell of Sunspear had let the Sarnori riders believe the southern wing was lighter than it was, softer than it was, and farther from support than it was. When the grassland nobles committed, lowering their long lances and driving for the seam between the siege camp and the outer cavalry screen, the Dornish bent backward, gave ground, and pulled them deeper into a pocket already marked on Stefan's board the night before. At the signal, horn followed horn. Martell riders wheeled. Baratheon reserve spears moved in oblique behind them. Then Lord Tytos Lannister came off the ridge with the western horse at full weight, not into the centre, but into the exposed side of the Sarnori noble line where armour was richest and room to recover poorest. The collision was brutal and close. Lances broke high. Saddles emptied. A banner bearing the sun wheel of Sarna vanished under men and hooves, rose once, and vanished again for good. From the walls of Hasdan the defenders could see the whole thing turning, and when they saw it turning, the city's courage began to go with it. Yet King Marcos of Sarna was no fool and no coward. He rallied his second line, pushed his foot hard at the half-breached district, and tried to salvage the battle by forcing one clean corridor into the city before the mounted wing collapsed beyond repair. This produced the fiercest fighting of the day, not on the open plain, but along the siege ramps and the shattered outer quarter where every path narrowed into stone, ash, and bodies. Prince Stefan changed armour there, not for vanity, but for function. He left the heavier showplate behind and came back into the breach in a shorter stormcoat over mail and plate, dark with soot, easier to move in through broken arches and stair courts. Later, painters preferred the crowned helm on horseback. Men who had actually been there remembered the second look, the prince on foot amid hot stone. Blood at the edge of his gorget, one gauntlet blackened from touching masonry still warm from fire, staring up toward the next barricade with the sort of cold anger that makes other men step forward instead of back. By dusk, the Sarnori effort had failed. Their horse was bloodied, their noble front mauled, their push toward the gate broken in 3 pieces and then hammered apart. King Marcos of Sarna escaped with a remnant and enough pride to keep his household intact, but not enough army to save Hasdan again. Prince Stefan did not pursue far. He understood what his father would have understood, that the city mattered more than the retreat, and that a holy stronghold left alive behind him would poison the eastern road longer than any half-beaten field king. So he turned back to the walls, tightened the lines, and resumed the siege with a new authority no one in the camp could miss. The prince had held the ring, beaten the relief host, and done it while the Empire watched from both sides of the sea. From that point on, men stopped speaking of whether he might be ready. They started speaking of what he would be called after the city fell. Inside Hasdan, the failed relief broke whatever order had been left. The bells that had rung in hope now rang in accusation. The sanctuary faction blamed the market lords. The market lords blamed the tower captains. The tower captains blamed the priests and began guarding grain like treasure, while children clawed at doorposts below them. Night murders increased. One faction burned another's storehouse to keep it from becoming a bargaining chip. Families crept from one district to the next behind hanging cloth and smoke, trying to reach the house of the Covenant and discovering that refuge had turned into trap. The city still had walls. It no longer had one mind. That is the point at which great sieges stop being contests of stone and start becoming executions that take time. Prince Stefan felt it and exploited it without mercy. He widened the breach instead of charging the sanctuary in one burst. He ordered engines brought closer under mantlets thick with wet hide. He had sappers work from 2 sides at once. He used archers not only to kill men on the parapets, but to deny movement between the defenders' own sectors, so that every quarter of Hasdan grew lonelier under attack. There was another quick scene remembered from those days. The prince, the war circlet dark with grime now, standing over a slain enemy captain in the shattered quarter, while a runner from the sea camp arrived breathless to report that Crown Hill had formally acclaimed King Lionel Baratheon and recognized Steffon as his chosen eastern heir in all but title. Steffon did not smile at the news. He looked once toward the sanctuary terraces, handed the dead captain's sword to a page, and gave the order to bring the next ram up before sunrise. So yes, the stronger addition was worth it. The kingdom of Sarner made the siege broader, bloodier, and more dangerous in the field, while Hazdan kept its own inner madness and sacred pressure inside the walls. That preserved the historical shape and deepened the war at the same time. The father took the west and the throne. The son took the east and the legend. The armor changed. The command changed. The whole empire could see it changing. And now the city is ready for its last phase, the breach into the holy center, the fighting around the House of the Covenant, and the destruction that will make Prince Steffon's name impossible to separate from Hazdan ever again. After the Sonori relief was broken, Prince Steffon Baratheon stopped treating Hazdan as a city that might yet be persuaded, and began treating it as a sacred fortress that would have to be taken in layers. The outer wards were already half dead, but the heart of the place still stood high above the wreckage, the terraces of the House of the Covenant, the court stairs, the narrow gate tunnels, and the inner walls where the keepers of the law had gathered whatever order, gold, relics, and courage they had left. From the lower breach, the prince could see the sanctuary rising through dust and heat, pale stone catching the late light while smoke rolled around it from the market quarter below. He ordered the camp tightened rather than loosed, and that decision mattered. Men who had expected a wild storm were forced instead into ditch work, mantlet hauling, tower raising, and the cold patience that makes the last assault possible. By then the host knew what he was doing. He was not just taking a city. He was arranging the death of its holy center in measured steps, so that when the moment came, nothing inside Hazdan would have room to breathe. Inside the city, the defeat of the Sonori host shattered the last hope of rescue, and with it the last pretense of unity. Lord Jonos of Gaz blamed the keepers of the law for hoarding grain behind sacred doors. Lord Simon Kadar accused the market captains of treachery, and sent armed men into alleys that should have been feeding refugees, instead of burying them. Keeper Eleazar of the inner court climbed the sanctuary stairs, and declared that surrender would defile the covenant more deeply than fire, and so the city answered with sermons, knives, and panic all at once. Noble households moved by night carrying icons, scroll cases, children, and the last little sacks of meal they had hidden from their own neighbors. Men were killed over cistern access, over stairway rights, over rumors that one gate or another might be opened before dawn. When a holy city reaches that point, it is no longer waiting to be saved. It is waiting to discover which faction will help destroy it. Prince Steffon began the final phase with 3 assaults at once. He widened the lower breach with hammering engines, sent sappers beneath one corner tower, and ordered a feint against the northern terrace stair, where the defenders still believed the ground too steep and confined for a real push. His center was formed of storm spears and crownland shields, heavy infantry trained to advance under falling stone without breaking their line. On the right he placed Prince Corin Martell of Sunspear, lighter men in scale and sandsilk beneath armor, quick enough to seize a stair, hold it, and vanish from one level of fighting to the next before a slower foe understood what had happened. On the left stood Lord Tytos Lannister, his western men in heavier plate and brighter metal, reserved for the moment when weight rather than speed would decide the passage. Before first light, the prince walked the line in the darker war armor he had taken after his father's departure, bronze war circlet low on the brow, black-ridged plate dulled with soot, not dressed for spectacle any more but for memory. Men later said the look in his eyes that morning was worse than anger. It was certainty. At one doorway, he stood with 6 household guards around him, while a barricade burned at arm's length, his sword low, his face blackened by smoke, waiting not for the flames to die, but for them to break just enough that he could send the next push through. That was the moment many in the host began calling him not merely prince, but Stormheir. The temple approaches were worse than the lower city, because every man fighting there knew exactly where he stood. The defenders had pulled back through the court of washings and the long portico beyond it, making each threshold a killing place, and each columned walk a trap for the men advancing under it. The keepers of the law did not all fight, but enough of them stayed in the upper courts reciting, ordering, pleading, and condemning that the whole sanctuary seemed to be shouting at once. Priests in white and saffron moving through smoke, while their own factions shoved refugees aside to protect the treasury rooms and the sacred inner stair. Prince Stefan tried once to call for surrender at the terrace gate, and the answer he got was a flight of darts and a boy no older than 12, hurling a stone from the parapet until an archer took him through the throat. After that, the prince gave no further summons. He ordered the ram forward. When the gate beam split and the terrace opened, the fighting turned from siege to sacrilege in a single breath. There was one last attempt inside Hasdan to preserve the sanctuary by sacrificing the city beneath it. Lord Simon Kedar tried to close the inner doors against his own people, pushing the wounded and the unarmed back into the court below, so the armed faithful could make the final stand with fewer mouths and more room. Lord Jonas of Gaz answered by trying to force the treasury side gate from within, hoping to buy his own survival with coin and hostages. The two factions met under the outer lintel of the House of the Covenant itself, and killed one another in front of the very doors they claimed to defend. By the time Prince Stefan's men broke onto the terrace above them, half the blood on those stones had already been shed by Hasdan's own hands. The prince saw it, understood it, and pressed harder. He sent the Dornish through the side court, the Westermen into the broken portico, and he led the center himself across the main stair under a rain of shattered tile, burning oil, and torn prayer banners. What happened in the sanctuary became the grief of a people and the making of a dynasty. Stefan did not enter as a looter first. He entered as a commander trying to take the place intact enough that its fall would mean submission and not mere ruin. He ordered the fire checked twice, once at the lower veil room and again at the cedar gallery leading toward the inner chamber. But the men had fought too long, lost too many brothers, and come too far through hunger, stone, and religious fury to obey perfectly in that moment. Some did not hear him. Some ignored him. Some were already stripping precious metals, breaking doors, and hurling torches deeper into the structure, because they believed the city would rise again if the sanctuary stood, the cedar screens caught. Then the cloth. Then the high carved beams above the inner hall. When flame climbed into the roofline of the House of the Covenant, the men of Hasdan made a sound the storm host remembered for the rest of their lives. Not a war cry, not a cheer. Something lower and fuller, a whole people realizing at once that the center of their world had begun to die. Prince Stefan went all the way to the inner threshold before the heat drove him back. He saw the gold work, the smoke, the fallen screens, the half-visible chamber beyond where only the holiest had once walked, and for one hard instant he tried again to preserve what could still be preserved. But by then the soldiers were inside in too many directions. The fire was in the beams, and the sanctuary had crossed that line beyond which command becomes witness. He turned from saving the structure to securing the fall, posting guards over the treasury spoils, sealing exits, and preventing the whole terrace from becoming a slaughter pit for every last refugee huddled against the inner courts. Even in victory, that choice mattered. It did not make the storming gentle, it made it sovereign. The prince was no longer only a siege commander breaking a rebel city. He was acting like the man who would inherit the consequences of what he had done. By nightfall, Hasdan had been taken in fact, though not yet fully pacified in memory. The sanctuary was burning, the upper courts were full of captives and bodies, and the last defenders were being dragged from side chambers, cistern mouths, and hidden stair landings where they had hoped to outlast the obvious ruin around them. From the lower camps, men could see the fire from miles away, a column of red lifting over the eastern hills, while the siege towers stood black against it like dead trees. In the command enclosure below, King Lionel Baratheon received the first report standing, listened without interrupting, and then asked only one question before dismissing the room, whether his son held the terrace. When told that he did, the king gave a single nod and ordered the standards raised at dawn over the captured heights. The next morning the stag banners flew above the broken courts of Hasdan, and the whole eastern road understood that a new house had not merely taken a throne in Crown Hill. It had carved its name into sacred history. The aftermath would matter almost as much as the assault. The spoils from the House of the Covenant would change Crown Hill. The Senate would grow with the eastern wealth and eastern men now crowding toward influence. The King's Council would harden into a permanent counterweight to robe politics. And Prince Stefan, who had begun the campaign as the king's son under his father's shadow, now stood in the eyes of the realm as the man who had broken Hasdan and survived the fire of its holy center. That is how dynasties stop being provisional. Not when they are crowned, but when their victories become too large for the realm to forget and too costly for the realm to undo.